Welcome to another exciting episode of NIDS Knowledge, the weekly show of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where we advance peace, promote stability, and help you to think deterrence. This episode is part of our regular Deterrence Down Under series, focused on Australia and our deterrence challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. Good day from Canberra. We hope you enjoy the show. Hey, welcome to Deterrence Down Under. I'm your host, Carl Rhodes.
Hey, I'm Christine Leah.
And today we've got a special guest joining us, Edward Geist, who's a policy researcher at RAND. He's also a professor of policy analysis at RAND School of Public Policy, what used to be called the Pardee RAND Graduate School, but has recently rebranded, from what I understand. His research portfolio includes Russia, civil defense, artificial intelligence, and links between emerging technology and nuclear strategy. And he's done some work on AI and the effect on nuclear strategy. But today we're going to talk about one of his books, Armageddon Insurance, Civil Defense in the United States and Soviet Union, 1945 to 1991. It's available on Amazon. I grabbed it. I haven't read the whole thing. I kind of skimmed some important parts of it, Ed, to get ready for this. So looking forward to talking to you about that. But first, let's jump to deterrence news. So OSMIN, the Australian-U.S. ministerial consultations, are kicking off again. That's the major meeting where foreign and defense ministers from both countries sit down to tune the alliance, set priorities, and kind of nudge each other on things, including force posture, industrial cooperation, other important issues for the alliance. It's where the two sides have, in the past, reaffirmed that the Indo-Pacific deterrence and joint capability building are the center of gravity for the relationship. This year's lead-up has been a mix of reassurance and increased pressure on Canberra. The recently completed U.S. review of AUKUS wasn't released publicly, but the reporting suggests Australia came out pretty well in that review. The program is set to deliver nuclear-powered submarines. That survived, and Canberra has been viewed as a credible contributor. At the same time, Pete Hegseth was just speaking in California at a major defense conference, and he warned at that summit that allies who don't lift their defense spending will face consequences. And he gave a short list of the countries that were model allies, which included countries like Israel, South Korea, Poland. Australia didn't make the list, and those model allies are supposed to receive special favor. So this set up an OSMIN that's just starting, where the alliance is strong, but expectations for Australia to step up its contributions are clearly there. So we'll see what happens behind the scenes as we get more reporting throughout the week. So that's the news for today. But let's get back to today's focus: civil defense and lessons from the Cold War that could help us today. So Ed, why don't you get us started by telling us what civil defense is? What is the definition of that?
So, civil defense is the use of passive means to protect population and industry from the effects of, in particular, for my book, it's nuclear attack. But more generally, it's not just nuclear attacks, but other kinds of military attacks, and as well as potentially other disasters. But that gets into the shady sort of like zone between civil defense and peacetime emergency management.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good. And in terms of civil defense, what were the goals for kind of the U.S. and Soviet Union back then? Nuclear war is something you don't want to fight and something that's tough to survive. So, what were the goals of civil defense and how did they start to think about it?
So this is something that evolved a lot over the course of the Cold War. And a big driver of this was changes in military technology. So back when they first started thinking about civil defense, which is basically, frankly, like I'm not even sure that the war was technically over yet when the U.S. started thinking about civil defense against atomic attack. So there was the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which famously went to the bombed out areas in both of the Axis powers. And so there was a guy named Barnett Beers who was a colonel in the army, but was also his job was to think about the future of civil defense. And so it's like the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey went to the atomic bomb cities in Japan and tried to learn basically lessons for civil defense from this. Now, when they were envisioning a nuclear war in the mid-1940s, it's very different from sort of like the thermonuclear missile war that became possible, really about 15 years after this, where the expectation was that atomic bombs would be relatively rare, they'd be relatively expensive, like they would be delivered by subsonic manned bombers. You take all those things together and it's like, well, this isn't, firstly, it's not an all-out apocalypse because they just don't expect enough bombs to be available. And furthermore, it's not instantaneous. Even though there is immediately this fear of this nuclear Pearl Harbor, there's this belief, it's like, look, it's like the bombers take a certain amount of time. The early bombs had a lot of sort of like physical limitations to them. So for instance, like in the US, this is declassified now all these decades later, the earliest bombs, the very first ones, they were literally hand-assembled by future Nobel laureates. They were basically experimental devices. They weren't properly weaponized. The first few years of nuclear weapons design, like the bomb is actually about the same as the bombs that were dropped on Japan in terms of the military performance, in terms of the destructiveness. It's only very marginally better in terms of the destructiveness. But they were actually trying to improve things. It's like, we need a bomb that doesn't need a Nobel laureate to put it together. It's like, we need a bomb that's at least marginally cheaper. But so when they start thinking seriously about civil defense, like the Soviets have their first A-bomb test in 1949, it's like, well, what they're envisioning is that there will be subsonic manned bombers, sort of like things B-29-ish, maybe a little bit better. And the reason that they're afraid is not that, oh, you can't detect these things and shoot them down, because you can. You absolutely could. The problem at that time is that the U.S. didn't really have radar coverage. So as of like 1950, the concern is like, well, the Soviet bombers like start showing up, and it's like, we don't actually have radars to detect this. Like, we don't have fusion sensors. Like there was this whole ground observer corps thing where they're trying to get civilian volunteers to literally like look up in the sky in binoculars and like phone somebody if you start seeing things. And at the time, like, it seems so totally crazy, but they were still building the radar networks. And they ended up building the radar networks. It was like by the end of the 50s, they have like the Pine Tree line and the distant early warning line. The whole point is they want to get tactical warning of these incoming bombers. But the takeaway from all of this, though, is that when they're planning for a nuclear war as of the early 1950s, the original civil defense is designed around what Bernard Brodie a few years after this termed the broken-backed war, which is the idea is that the war will start, they're expecting the war to start maybe with an atomic Pearl Harbor, but not a big enough one to sort of take the country completely out of the war at once. It's like, oh, well, New York and D.C. and so forth, these places will get A-bombed. But you look at the destructiveness of an individual A-bomb of this vintage, it's like a few tens of kilotons. It's like, yes, this is destructive, but it's like it's not destructive enough to actually like obliterate New York with one bomb. And so there was this expectation that it's like, even though like the places that are A-bombed will obviously be severely damaged, there'll be a lot of places that will only be moderately damaged. And there's also this concern that once this happens, the rest of the country will just sort of like lose its cohesion and they won't be able to actually fight the war. Because basically what they're envisioning as the war is World War II with occasional A-bombs going off. It's actually more or less the way that they envision. Like they envision doing a large-scale economic mobilization in order to wage what, to a significant extent, would be a conventional campaign against the communist bloc. Now, this, even as from the standpoint of a couple of years later, this seems terribly quaint, but this was the plan. Civil defense in the U.S., as it was originally designed, was intended as part of that plan. It's like there was this notion that civil defense is in part supposed to be enabling all of the parts of this that would make it possible to have this sustained campaign with the goal of ultimately managing to either like drive the communists back or fight them to a standstill. There are actually some remarkable narratives of this. The famous issue of Collier's about the war we do not want that has a whole narrative of a war like this. So this is a special issue of the magazine from 1951. And civil defense's features and part of it, and the U.S. Civil Defense Organization of the time actually circulated this around as something that they wanted people to read. But it talks about how the war opens with like the Soviets like have their nuclear Pearl Harbor and like they A-bomb New York and things like that. And then like 5 or 6 years later, it's like U.S. troops are occupying Moscow.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is the way this was not considered a joke at the time. Like it seems terribly quaint given that a couple of years after this, you get the H-bomb and then you get the ICBM and the nature of the war changes. So civil defense originally in the U.S. and also in the Soviet Union, the thinking at the time was pretty similar. Like civil defense is supposed to actually enable sustained combat in this protracted sort of war. after a few years, and like the nuclear attack gets so much more destructive, like it gets so much faster, but also just that nuclear weapons get both cheaper and much more numerous and much more destructive. And so between all of this, like they're expecting the speed and scale of the attack to literally be orders of magnitude larger than they were being expected in the early 50s. And so at that point, the goal of civil defense is really more to improve marginal outcomes. And so you look at the case that the U.S. Civil Defense Organization at this point was under DOD. So in the beginning of the Cold War, when they first found it in the Truman administration, it's a separate executive branch agency. Then under Kennedy, it's folded under the Department of Defense, and until the late 70s, it's like part of the Department of Defense. And so the DOD basically said it's like, oh, well, like we have these models. It's like there's this famous damage limiting study, for instance, that Glenn Kent did. And so it talks about the relative cost effectiveness of civil defense, in this case, like a public fallout shelter program. Active defenses, like missile defenses, like this time it was still Nike X when the study was done. And active counterforce to try and like thin out the Soviet attack and things like that. And basically what it said is like, oh yeah, you should buy the fallout shelters. So the fallout shelters looked good in the cost benefit analysis, but they're sort of like picking the low-hanging fruit of survival was the theory. It's like, we're going to have these public fallout shelters. The idea is that there's supposed to be more fallout shelter spaces than there were people living in the U.S. So that like, well, it's like, I'm in somewhere different in the daytime and the nighttime. It's like, you have to make sure there are fallout shelters for people near where they are when the war starts. You know, they expect it to be like a missile war, right? And the fallout shelters are not meant to protect people. It's like, if you're in sort of like the, within a couple of miles of like this H-bomb that comes in off the ICBM going off, it's like, no, the fallout shelter is not going to help you. But the theory was, and now we know because we have enough declassified Soviet documents, that when they designed this system, their estimate of what the Soviets were intending to do at the time was right, which is that the Soviets are going to build a relatively small, meaning a few hundred ICBMs, but armed with extremely high-yield warheads. So the idea is there are not that many ground zeros. The people who are near those ground zeros really are just sort of like toast. But it's like there's a huge areas downwind of those ground zeros, so they're very high-yield weapons. You would expect to have these like potentially lethal fallout effects. That would include potentially a lot of population who could be saved. And furthermore, that the ICBMs of that era, like even in testing, they had pretty low reliability, right? So you combine this with the other factors, and it's like, oh yeah, the incoming attack, even if it's well designed in terms of its optimality of targeting, some of the missiles just won't work. So even if they've got a certain amount of overkill, and with only a few hundred missiles, there's not that much opportunity for overkill, right? So you would expect some things that are directly targeted to survive. So people at the time were like, why on earth are they putting up these fallout shelters like in the middle of these major cities? It's like, it actually, within the context of what they were doing, it did make sense. There was also this hope that maybe the Soviets would come around to like sort of like what Herman Kahn called like a counterforce with avoidance sort of targeting doctrine, where it's like they would not target the city on purpose. And so it might be that, yes, there's a fallout hazard that's coming from some military target upwind. This was another thing that they were trying to hedge against. Now, in practice, like what happened was, firstly, Congress defunded the fallout shelter program. So the fallout shelter program, obviously it got away, because in the U.S. you still see the signs, right? You still occasionally, you'll encounter like the chemical toilets in the antique shop and things like that. It's like a lot of this stuff was made, but they never actually stocked most of the shelters that were marked. And the program that they were trying to get funded would have basically paid people to try and like, it was called slanting. The idea is you change the design of the building you're building so that they'll offer more fallout shelter space, with the goal of like having this goal relative to the anticipated 1970 U.S. population. So 1964, this ends up getting defunded. And so most of this activity is like concentrating this burst basically between the Cuban Missile Crisis and 1964. So it still continues at a low level after this, but never in the same way again. And then what ends up happening is MIRVs are invented, right? So, and the Soviets build more ICBMs, and then they MIRV those ICBMs. So instead of the attack that the fallout shelter system is designed for, which is a few hundred very high yield single warhead ICBMs, we have several, like the Soviets ended up with about 1,300 in the end, land-based missiles. Like, they're bigger on average than most of the U.S. ones. And then so you have like several thousand warheads in the like several hundred kiloton-ish sort of yield range. And depending on how that's targeted, that poses like a considerably different problem to civil defense. But by this point, it's like the fallout shelter program had been sidelined in favor of a strategic evacuation program.
Okay.
Yes.
And how long were people expected to be in the fallout shelters? Did they ever get that far? Or they're just like, oh, we'll put people in the
So
shelters.
was a matter of considerable discussion. And it actually became a real problem in the early 1960s when they were planning this fallout shelter system, because they were really hoping that people would only have to stay in the shelters for a few days. And like, can you guess the reason why that was?
They need to get back to work?
Well, I mean, like that wasn't it, but like they might need to. So the reason was actually thermal management in the shelter. So what happens if you have like this? If you go in these places with the fallout shelter signs, you're just like, this is a basement, right?
Right.
And I don't know if you've ever had like a particularly crowded like basement party, right? But you know how it starts getting sort of like hot and humid and kind of unpleasant. So it turns out that unless your shelter has very few people in it compared to sort of like its ability to exchange heat with the outside, it'll start heating up and it'll hit like sort of the wet bulb temperature, and the people inside will start like potentially dying of heat stroke after a certain period of time.
Oh, wow.
So the original hope was that like, oh, well, like if these fallout shelters are far enough from sort of like the target areas, maybe you'll still have electrical power and you'll still have the ventilation coming from that. But also there was this hope initially that it's like, oh, if you're only in the shelter for 3 days, it doesn't have enough time to get that hot inside. But otherwise, It's like you really need the ventilation. This was one of the things that it was recognized. They developed a means, like basically these pedal-powered ventilators that they could put into the shelter stocks. These were made, they were prototyped, there are collectors who have them. Very few of them actually got put into shelters. So, like, they had solutions to these problems, like, on paper, but this was never actually completely actualized all the way.
So it's like a combination of Soul Cycle and survival all at once. You know, Soul Cycle is a bicycle fitness class in the Los Angeles area. So, yeah, so you're up on the bike today. That's really, I had not thought about that piece of it. You know, the underground rave scene and the fallout shelter scene could learn something from one another, you know, about heat management and people's, you know, ability to generate heat in a closed environment. That's really fascinating. So how did the Russians approach this? You know, the Soviets, I should say, at the time, you know?
Yes. So this was an area in which, like in the U.S., there was this tendency to try and push off like investment in civil defense to, like basically not just state and local authorities, but all the way down to like there's this whole home fallout shelter era, particularly under Eisenhower up to the beginning of Kennedy when they're trying to stand up this community shelter program. There's a sort of like impetus. It's like, well, people, in fact, there was actually U.S. government information at the time that actually just said, it's like, civil defense is a personal responsibility. It's just like the notion of it's like, oh yeah, it's like this whole nuclear war thing, like surviving it, that's kind of on you.
Yeah.
And so in the Soviet Union, it's different, where there's this premise that, so with the Soviet propaganda will promise you is like, oh yeah, there'll be shelters for you. It's like they don't tell you where the shelters are in peacetime. And when I was researching my dissertation, I talked to a bunch of Russians who were just like, I don't think there are any shelters. I don't know where the shelters are. The funny thing is there actually were a lot of shelters. And so, for instance, once I learned how to recognize them, I was like, oh yeah, actually they are these old Soviet era shelters. They are everywhere. But I also got enough documents out of the archives where it's like, well, how many of them were there? And it's like, by American standards, there were a lot of them. Compared to like the Soviet urban population, there weren't that many of them. It's like there were enough of the blast shelters for, depends on the city, but it's like at most like a few tens of percent and usually a lot less than that. Because the plan as it evolved over time was that they were going to use a combination of evacuation and sheltering with like several different categories of shelters. So unlike in the U.S. where we only ever sort of like researched and some of the civil defense people were sort of like aspiring to this idea like, oh, we'll have blast shelters. So like shelters that could actually survive being pretty close to a nuclear weapon that goes off. The Soviet Union actually built some of these things. And not just for the most elite leadership. Is that the idea was that you'd have different tiers of evacuation because they're worried about a protracted crisis seemingly. It's like they're thinking that the war might start and therefore they take the like children, for instance, like there are these evacuation plans, like we're just going to send you to some like remote part of the Soviet Union that we think isn't going to get nuked, right? And so like I saw in the archives is like some evacuation plans where it's like the children from like such and such a district will be put on this train and it will be going to like this place in the Caucasus. And whereas other people who were involved in critical war industries, idea is like, well, we don't want those people just running off. It's like, especially because you just put their children on a train to the local Soviet Union. It's like, people, this is going to happen and people are going to panic and just leave town, right? It's like, so you have to give them some sort of assurance that, like, they can stay and, like, won't just be killed. And so the way that they did that is that, they had what it was called рассредоточение or dispersal. And so the idea there was that some of the population would be rotated out to these places that were fairly close to the cities, but like not close enough you'd expect to be destroyed by blast effects. They would prepare fallout shelters in those locations for the populations that are supposed to be dispersed. And then there were blast shelters for the people actually still in the cities, with the idea that those people might be getting rotated out over the period of extended crisis with the people who are in this sort of dispersal zone. So the idea there is that, there's this, like, we're a critical factory. We want to keep it running until the last possible moment. And so if you're actually at the factory, there is, like, a proper blast shelter there. And I've been inside of a couple of these things. Like, by the time you get to, like, the late 70s, they're very remarkable, like, how sophisticated they got and how we only ever in the U.S. research this stuff. We never tried to build things like this. In the Soviet Union, they would get built into certain kinds of facilities. Once again, there were nowhere near enough of them for everyone. It's like these are for certain subcategories of the population, but contrary to the stereotype you sometimes heard in the U.S., it's not just for the leadership. It's like this is for critical industrial workers and people like that who happen to be at the factory at the time that things go down. This whole scheme, of course, like it relies on strategic warning. So strategic warning meaning that it's like you start doing this before the war actually starts. It's like, say you're in some sort of Cuban Missile Crisis like sort of situation, like you see that things might be getting bad. And so as you start moving the part of the population who's non-working, like retirees and children, like you move them out of the cities, you move around the working population some. Now, the reality that I've seen Soviet archival documents where they just admitted this, it just is like, once they start doing any of this, is like a lot of people are just going to flee the countryside. Because this is the precedent in the wars in Russia in the 20th century. It's like World War I. There's a book that I read in grad school called Whole Empire Walking about population displacement during World War I. Same thing in World War II, where like a whole lot of people fled the Nazis on foot under their own power, and Communist Party sort of coordinated part of this, but a lot of it is people just sort of like picking up their bindles and like walking east, right? It's like the expectation at the time, because this is all in living memory in this era. So it's like in the 70s, it's like it's only been 50 some years since World War I, and then it's been, like a lot more recently World War II. It's like, this is all very immediate to them. So the expectation is like, it's like you announced that like there might be a nuclear war and that you need to do all this stuff, and people are just going to like try and flee to the safest place that they think that they can. And the notion that they're all going to follow like the official government plan, which frankly was like, I'm probably making the sound like they had their act together a lot more than they did. It's like there were certain things where it's like, yes, they have like fallout and bomb shelters that they built. And like in U.S. standards, there's a lot of that. Compared to what the plan said that they needed versus the amount they actually had, is like there's a big gap there. So in the sense of, it's like, do Soviet leaders look at all this as people in the U.S. in the 1970s, like, they think that they could survive and win a nuclear war? It's just like, no, they have an aspiration to do this. It's like, in some ways, they might be even more aware of the extent to which the delta between what they would need and what they actually had than U.S. leaders who, in some ways, just like didn't think through this as much a lot of the time.
It was more symbolic than an actual plan, potentially.
Well, so I won't say that it's purely symbolic, because like building these bomb shelters and things, it involved a lot of like real resources. Like there were real opportunity costs involved that they were paying, but at the same time, the extent to which the program that they had could make a difference depending on, it would be interesting to try and analyze it now, given the ability to go back and try and use historical data. Because we actually did this, it's like there would be modeling done at RAND and other places back in the old days where it's like, well, how many what would you expect civilian casualties to be in the Soviet Union in a nuclear war? And then they have these parameters for different civil defense programs. So it's like, population relocation and like the degree of fallout sheltering and things like that. Today we have enough data that we could actually do a more informed version of that sort of modeling. It's the sort of thing that I find interesting, but is, shall we say, doesn't attract strong sponsor interest most of the time. So,
yeah. Christine, I think you got a question, don't you?
Oh, cheers, Carl. Hey, Ed. I got a bit of a tricky one for you, and you don't feel like you have to, come up with a magic answer. It's really interesting because Australia's kind of thinking through these issues in the context of being involved in a potential conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. There has been some debate about, how much does Australia invest in missile defense as part of deterrence or government thinking about deterrence. But I'm wondering to what extent, and again, this is a really tricky question, so don't feel pressured anyway. I'm wondering to what extent does a country like Australia, which has a very, just a few cities on a massive landmass, invest in passive versus active missile defense regarding one, populations, and two, military forces involved in said potential conflict.
Basically solve all of Australia's force posture problems.
Go!
But what can we learn from, the experience in the Cold War, potentially? Take it in that route. Yeah.
Right. So I think I would put it like this. So what we did in the U.S. back in the day was we had the damage limiting study. And the idea is it's actually all cost effectiveness analysis, right? And so the idea is you take all the different components and you try and come up with the marginal cost effectiveness of the different components. Admittedly, there are interactions between them, so it's not like they're completely independent. But you try and take your concrete problem. So in this case, they were interested not in sort of abstractions. It was the U.S. and the Soviet Union, as they expected them to be in 1970, as of their best guess in 1963, 64 sort of time frame. And so they projected out. Okay, well, we expect the Soviets to have this kind of offensive force that would pose this kind of threat to U.S. Target systems. We expect to have these kinds of forces. What would we expect, for instance, is the marginal dollar spent on Nike X versus the fallout shelters? This is one of the questions that they're trying to answer. And so the structure of the relative target systems matters enormously for this kind of problem. So it's not something that I can just answer off of the cuff. It's more a matter of you need to think, and some of this comes down to priorities of how invested do you want to be in population defenses versus buying, for instance, point defenses for military bases and so forth. Because one of the things that we've seen in the recent wars in the Middle East is a lot of this stuff worked a lot better than not just the naysayers expected it to, but even some of the folks who are shall we say, less than missile defense pilled, it expected it to work. It's really remarkable that, but at the same time, it comes back to the cost. And this is one of the reasons why going back to the Glenn Kent sort of methodology is so attractive, is because the way that they did the damage limiting study, and the reason it was so rhetorically effective, is when they wanted to, they wanted numbers how well is Nike X going to work? It's let's just ask the Army to tell us how well it will work. And the Army, of course, gives them what was a very optimistic prediction for how well it would work in terms of cost effectiveness. And they do the whole calculus, and it turns out that it still doesn't look like it's a good buy versus the fallout shelters, right? Yeah. And it's a similar sort of thing. So you have to analyze things systemically, not going for a predetermined kind of answer. And then you come up with, and some of it's apples and oranges sort of trade-offs where it's okay, well, how important, because it could be that you would think that, okay, well, more point defense for the military forces might actually be better from a deterrence standpoint. However, if deterrence fails, it's it's actually maybe not going to make that marginal of a difference, right? That it's not just a simple matter of dollars and cents. And some of that, it's above my pay grade, fortunately. But unfortunately, someone has to make the decision about that kind of trade-off.
Yeah. Yeah, I was fortunate enough to work with Glenn Kent for a number of years, and one of the real challenges also was how do you value a human life versus military, equipment versus civilian infrastructure. How you can't really put a dollar value on a human life easily. So there is that challenge too, even when you try to do something like a cost effectiveness analysis with the best assumptions. And you also have to know how the enemy is going to target too, in terms of how they think about it. And there's a two-sided game that gets played there. How you set up your defenses will drive how they target, and how they target will drive how you set up your defenses.
Right. And so you can also send messages with the way you invest certain things where it's like, oh, well, you send signals about what you think is important, or alternatively, it's just kind of Murphy's Law. So what we saw during the Cold War is that the adversary is going to somehow like misinterpret whatever you do in like the maximally paranoid way, potentially, where there were reports that Westerners who were going around the Soviet Union asking them about their civil defense program in the 80s were told as like, oh, well, we assume that the Americans don't have this sort of thing because they're actually just so arrogant that they think that maybe they can just sort of take us out in the first strike. That was anecdotally reported, and I never know how to interpret these reports. Like people saying, well, I go around the Soviet Union and talk to some people, and they told me X. Is like, it's like, okay, did they? Like, maybe they did.
Yeah. So, Ed, last couple of questions because we got to wrap up pretty soon here. First of which is there's been kind of a renaissance in thinking about civil defense, not necessarily in the nuclear way, although partially by Europe. They are getting more on a footing of informing their populations about what things to do and all that. And Australia here, it's been kind of quiet. So how do we think about being prepared for conflict? We're pretty good at preparing for natural disaster, as we talked about last episode, but not for conflict. But at the same time, not panicking everyone that the war is going to start tomorrow, and not sending the wrong message that, we're getting ready to fight the war.
Right. Yeah, so it's tricky in that in the modern era, it's like if you're thinking about trying to have a true all-hazard sort of system that covers not just like, oh, well, we want to have emergency management against peacetime disasters. We also want to have civil defense against various kinds of wartime attacks, and like a defense against military attacks that is optimized against conventional sort of munitions, like the stuff we've been seeing in the Middle East, against nuclear attack, which could be not just sort of like the Cold War model of like, oh, sort of like enormous numbers of strategic weapons, but rather something much more selective, maybe fought with smaller weapons in various sorts of ways. Also, the nightmare scenarios of the kinds of, especially like biological weapons that may be possible with contemporary technology. And it's like, okay, that is a lot of bases to cover. That is a whole lot of bases to cover. And it's enough that like, it's not like any reasonable attainable amount of money is actually going to significantly cover all of those, even though like we can make a lot of progress against quite a bit of it. So like, it really comes down to is like, well, what scenarios do you want to prioritize? And I do think that there's a case probably against the notion of we do a little of everything and hope that like it'll all add up to something good. It's like, I think that that's not really a great solution. That said, when we were talking about adversary reaction and counter-reaction sort of cycles, the problem with only being prepared for one or two things really is that, well, the adversary is just going to do something else, right?
Yeah.
Like, unless they're so unreactive or something like that, that they just are incapable of responding to your counter move, then they're just going to like exploit the obvious vulnerabilities. So I apologize that I don't have a neat answer for that question.
There isn't one, right? I mean, this is a real challenge for any nation.
Yeah.
So yeah, great. Well, really great having you here, Ed. It's been great learning more about the history of the Cold War and how we can, think about it today and given today's challenges. For all of our listeners, jump out and take a look at Ed's book. You can get it on your Kindle for a very reasonable price, or you can order a hard copy. Either way, He's got up there if you're watching the video. And I also want to thank our listeners. Encourage you to subscribe to our show and review our podcast. Leave a written review, please. It'll help others find us. And lastly, I hope you have a great day. And remember to always think deterrence. Thank you for listening to NIDS Knowledge, Deterrence Down Under. This show is produced under the NIDS Podcasting Network, division of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. NIDS is a U.S.-based 501c3 organization dependent upon donations to provide this podcast and bring about awareness of the peacekeeping value of U.S. strength, alliances, and deterrence. You can catch all of our podcasts or provide feedback at thinkdeterrence.com. I thank our producer, Kimberly Charrington, our sponsors, and all the fantastic members of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for making this podcast possible. Stay tuned next week for another exciting and informative NIDS Knowledge.
The NIDS Podcasting Network.